Blog Talk Radio.
Good morning. It's Thursday. And how do you know it's Thursday? Because it's Venus Unplugged Day. And this is your virtual Heartbreak Hotel. And what we do here is we talk about all things that have to do with Venus and our way through this labyrinth of love and meaning and heartbreak and storytelling, both personal and transpersonal. And what we are talking about and exploring is the teaching tale of Snow White, which is quite profound. Who needs vampire stories when you can be tyrannized by fairy tales? The real ones, not the ones that are washed and wash white, okay, but the ones the original ones. So we spoke about, how Snow White was created in the image, her mother, who was a queen, a lone queen in the middle of the winter. So just that evokes. See, the thing about fairy tales, as soon as you hear Once Upon a Time, just suspend it all, okay? Let the tale teach you, because the soul listens. Psyche, it's like giving Psyche a fairy tale. She loves that, and we grow from it. So, in the last two episodes, we talked about Snow White and how her mother dreamed her up, so to speak. So this is soon after she, the queen, gave birth to a daughter whose skin was as white as snow, whose cheeks and lips were as red as blood, and whose hair was as black as ebony wood, and thus she was called Snow White. But when the child was born, the queen died. Wow. So Snow White comes, first she's dreamed up from the mother's narcissistic need to be mirrored in some way, to have a daughter of her fantasies, right? The child comes in, obviously immaculate conception, because there's no father around, there's no male energy, no king. He shows up once, and this child is born exactly as the mother longed for. And then what happens? After a year, the king took another wife. So for 1 year, Snow White is motherless. And then look at the mother she gets. She gets like the essence of the evil stepmother, right? But what is that like? What is that like for all of us to be motherless? We all know moments of motherlessness, okay? And motherless women very often beget, motherless daughters. And any time that happens, so just that, a motherless child, what that means is motherless children, within and without, belong to the great mother. So the drama begins. That's part of what this coding means. She's not completely an orphan. She's motherless for a year, and then the embodiment of the Dark Mother is about ready to manifest itself. But let's go over what these mean, because this is what's so fascinating. And this is one interpretation. You can interpret this. That's the genius of why fairy tales last for thousands of years, as do dreams. It is the interpretation, and for every person who reads this, they're going to pull something else out of it. So, and after a year, the king took another wife, and she was a beautiful woman, but proud and arrogant, and she could not stand to let anyone exceed her in beauty. And she had this marvelous mirror, and whenever she stepped before it and gazed at herself, she said, "Mirror, mirror, here I stand. Who's the fairest in the land?" Okay, Now, the drama thickens. I mean, that's enough to make your blood run cold, somebody like that. So I hope you're picking up what I'm putting down, because this is some serious... This goes on internally and this goes on externally. All right? So the first year, Snow White is without not a mother or father or siblings, and she's in this emotional void. And, you know, my heart goes out to that, because when a child is not mirrored, they're going to have issues, all right? So the three colors of Snow White are also associated with the rebirth, okay, of consciousness, and it revivifies consciousness. So the mother's fantasy, the child is born, the mother and the queen represents the old kingdom, and here this new energy comes in. So how do we look at that in our life? It's like when the queen, which is a principle that we've lived by, suddenly dies, and a new energy is born. Or when we want to do something new, the old queen's got to go, or the old king's got to go. So these three colors, they represent rebirth, because the colors of white, red, and black are the colors of alchemy. And they're the stages of alchemy, okay? So the possibility of our transformation out of the blacken, that's the alchemical degrado. Now, a black state can also be a depressed state, out of the void, out of the darkness. We don't, but something's going to be born. And anybody who's experienced that dark night of the soul knows what that feels like. But without a negrado, without a blackening, without a darkening, without our mistakes and our sins and our just plain dumbness, we're not going to have a process. All right. And through the states of whiteness, which is the albino, okay, and then the redness, the rubio, all right. So the albino is the purifying and the purity, and the red, the rubio, is the blood. So these are the symbolic form of the queen's wish. Now, the child in fairy tales, and in dreams also, the child is always the symbol of new life and new meaningful change. And just notice that there's no king or sibling, hints at which the creative life has been completely repressed for years, and to a certain extent must start again, beginning again. No king, no siblings, no new creativity. And she's born out of this. It's kind of miraculous. And that is what happens also. We can feel like we're in a desert creatively, or our heart just can't connect, or, whatever barrenness we're experiencing. And yet there's always that little potential that wants to be born. Okay? So this child represents this, and Snow White is the birth of the new feminine in the soul, both in men and in women. And it's the new feeling value. And for those of you who've been kind of following along, I remember the story of Psyche, all right? And she gives birth, drum roll, to a girl, which indicates the culture needs a new version of the feminine, or a more evolved version of the feminine. Okay? And this is another sign that this is showing it, and it sure is happening in all of us. So the conflict between the daughter and the mother, and between the old principle consciousness and the new, it's like a vital impulse. When we symbolically give birth, or literally give birth, okay, and let's say a mother goes into a depression because she doesn't know what happened to her, whether it be chemical, emotional, whatever it may be. We feel that, and I've spoken to many of a motherless child. But if on some level you're a motherless child, your job is to go look for what the great mother has in store for you. Because that's your tree of life. That's where you belong. All right? Because it's impossible to be without mother. She may be invisible. We may find her in somebody else, in an aunt, in a mentor, something. We will always find the mother, okay? And hopefully the loving mother. So this birth of the feminine in the soul, okay? Now, this fairy tale states that the new impulse, Snow White, is more beautiful, that the daughter goes further and stands closer to wholeness than does her mother. And for that, we manifest that witch, all right? In another version of Snow White, the mother is the evil destroyer of the daughter. I know lots of people who've had that experience, all right? That doesn't make them, and it may not be one's personal mother. If someone has no connection to the feminine, it's pretty hard to mother. And they were motherless children. And it goes on and on. And it does come a point when we have to retell ourselves the story. Because bottom line is, we wanted to incarnate, and we knew the storyline, and if we incarnated through the motherless mother, we go in search of our own feminine. That's the resolution. So, now this gets represented, this evil destroyer of the daughter. So, as again, the older version or in other versions of Snow White, the mother is the evil destroyer of the daughter. And this is represented in the snow, which represents death, and in the blood, that represents life. All these little hints they describe. Okay. So the conventional or the old customary is always the enemy of the new. And also, the blood and the snow represent opposites. This is very significant in storytelling, in dreams, in the work of Jung, which is one of his greatest contributions, is, to looking at the opposites. And also, there will be no alchemical process, there will be no creative story, there will be no love affair, there will be no nothing if there's not an opposite, because that is what creates the tension. Without an enemy, there's no story. Without something to come up against, we're not, there's no opposite to get that friction, to make life happen. It's just beige. Everything just is beige or Snow White. Okay. So the daughter is she's named Snow White, but she's only named one of the three colors. Again, that's a hint. Why not red, black, and white? Why or rose red or rose black, or no, just the one color. So we know it's just one-sided. So the new life is now associated with the color white, which is death. And she's born out of death. She comes onto the earth through the death mother. That's powerful, powerful stuff. And yet she must be born. And how many times does that happen in our lives? Out of nothingness, out of death, something new is born. Or how many times can you feel dead? Like, oh man, there's nothing happening in my life. There's so nothing happening. And that we feel invisible to others, and we feel invisible to ourselves. And it's once again, dark night of the soul. But I guarantee you, something's cooking in there if we can wait and not try to fix it or appease it or be with it. And white also represents innocence and purity and an unlived life. So here she's born, and she's actually white. Snow is white, and white is white. Okay, so we've got a double white there. Wherever there's two, you better start paying attention. If in a dream you have a dream motif and you dream it twice, or the number 2 is in the dream, wake up. Your life is, your psyche is saying, we need some tension of the opposite. And if you don't want to make it conscious, I'll help you. I'll make it conscious for you. All right. And then something happens in our life that we can't believe, and then the story begins, and we've got to go at that again. So it represents this innocence and this purity and this unlived life. She has got no survival skills. So innocence and purity are not going to help her survive. It's not going to help her transform, and it doesn't help. It doesn't flourish the child's needs. It's the black and the darkness. And it is, because that is the great mother. No story without darkness. And the red and the effect, and that's the feeling and the blood. So without those three things, she's not going to make it to her feminine wholeness. There can be no rebirth without the three colors. Otherwise, it's just sterile. So this is like trauma at its like coolest. But her name is Double White. So what happens when we're too innocent? I call it dangerous innocence, and I see it all the time. I just want to be positive. Is that good or bad? Is that positive? It's dangerous, man. Because you're one-sided, and the innocence is, you're not going to survive with that kind of stuff, okay? Or you're not going to move into wholeness. You'll be one-sided. But you won't have an individuation process, okay? So in ourselves, we find it difficult to take up personal guilt, because that's the blackening. Did something, it's dark, and we work very hard to convince others of their guilt for our misery. So when all that projection is going on and somebody's blaming somebody else, or in your fantasy world, that person did this to me, blah, blah. No. Put that down. Because you're being given an opportunity to see your own shadow, and there's gold in that darkness. But if we're always projecting what the other person did, or how, if only they would stop saying that or being that or whatever, then I could be whole. No, you take the little piece of darkness, or you take the coal, it's going to turn into a diamond, all right? But when we don't want any darkness, no process. Or when people say, well, if it wasn't for you, and then, just think about it, what's going off in your head. Just write down the sentence. If it weren't for you, and then name whoever the person is, or whatever the person is, or, okay, I'd certainly feel a lot better. And really look at that. Because that's the refusal to experience personal guilt. Because even if a person did do that to you, you don't have to believe their projections. Okay? But you can say, if somebody's projecting some, darkness onto me, even though it may not be literally true, I still look at it as kind of like a waking dream, and I think, where could that be true? Not in the way they're seeing it. But where could that be true? Where could there be some darkness that I actually need for my own personal living story? Because what other people think of you is none of your business. That's what's going off in their head. So use that in a way. Because that's sometimes the way the hint comes. Somebody comes across and accuses you of something. It's like, what? Really? Where could that be true? And it always could be a little bit true. And that's when we kind of catch that Negredo energy, and then we know we're really onto an individuation process. So with the Snow White, it seems to imply a principle of double innocence or guiltlessness, which constellates a corresponding defense mechanism or repression mechanism of extreme intensity. So if you only be white and good and spiritual and all the stuff, the one-sidedness, all right, that's dangerous, because in your unconscious, in your psyche, it's going to constellate, which means constellation is when it empowers its opposite inside of you. And that's got to live out. And everybody knows somebody who, their intentions might be good, but damn, stay out of my life with your intentions, okay? Or somebody who's, so spiritual, but meanwhile they're character assassinating everybody who doesn't believe in what they believe in. So that's their shadow. We see that across the board. So when there's too much goodness, shadow goes in, and that witch finds her mirror within. All right? So this is why we need to be more balanced, this double innocence. I call it a dangerous innocence. So we are all in great archetypal danger if we stay in a state of the double white. Archetypal danger, not just personal danger. Because the story always has to have, 3 is the number of creation. The 2 create an opposite, and out of the opposites comes the solution or the third factor or the creative idea, whatever it might be. So we all stay in this dangerous archetype where we only want the good. If there's no bloodshed, no consciousness of shadow leads one to a one-sided, frozen life of goodness. I can hear you screaming now. That's okay. Without sin, and sin just means missing the mark, we did the wrong thing. When we decide, and most people don't decide, they're unceremoniously invited by their psyche, it's usually very rude, into what consciousness is. It always comes in a disaster. Some great event or some life event, love affair ends, somebody dies, or whatever it might be. There's a loss. That's the beginning of the story. So without these negative, without the dark, there is no light. They won't know about one another. They need one another. So this is very, very dangerous archetypally. So when I say sin is the etymology of the word sin is an archery term that means missing the mark. We shot an arrow and we missed the mark. Right? That's what it means. Okay? So without sin, there's no story, there's no action, and there's nothing to build against. And our soul freezes over in pure white snow and goodness. So it's a form of death. Now, there were things that are absolutely wrong, but even with that, without, that's why we watch the news every night, or we watch all these crime things, or, actually I don't have television, so I don't watch it, but that we're shadow dancing. It's like, man, I wouldn't do that, so I'm pretty good today. I mean, I didn't, shoot anybody, okay, or whatever, but we could have shot somebody with something, we said, all right? So Snow White is the name for the spirit world and the upper realm of the spirit world, but not the earth of sexuality nor death and the underworld. These are the qualities she will have to connect with on her own. So it foretells the plot's thickening. So the wicked stepmother, she represents the dark goddess. And you see the dark goddess that her mother never came to know and offers them to her. Symbolically integrating the red and the black represents the initiation that confronts a woman from going from a girl to a woman. This is all in the first paragraph. Do you believe this? It's astounding to me. So also when we look at in terms of initiation of the divine feminine, women's blood rights, our moon, our first blood, there's a lot of trauma with a young woman's first blood and the way that that's dealt with. But that's a different subject matter. But there's your drops of blood, okay? So the story tells us of the multiple problems of being unmothered. With the mirroring of the maternal mother. So mirroring, what does that look like? That's when we look in the child's eyes and wonder, who is this miraculous soul that's come to this planet and this journey? But if children are not mirrored, or if one has not been mirrored, you've been marked by the Great Mother. You've been chosen by the Great Mother that you're capable of an individuation process. That's what that means. Okay? So children cannot feel valued for being themselves and cannot develop sound boundaries or learn to make good choices if they're not seen in the mother's eyes. Or it could be, it doesn't have to be a female. It's someone's eyes. Even an animal loving them, it helps. Okay? See, without the maternal mother mirror, and this does not have to be bio mom, but a person whose warm-blooded feeling and of relatedness, and you can see yourself in their eyes. That's what mothers spend a lot of time doing, holding their babies and just looking in their eyes. And that is what gives the child the connection that it is sensed symbolically. The mother is a tree. She has her roots deep in the earth. Her trunk is the body. And the leaves and the branches are all the imagination and a place for life to flourish. So without the maternal mirroring, we suffer greatly. But that's also the beginning of the story. So we look at that and try not to, we certainly have to tell that story again and again, but at some point we need to change that story because it's just too one-sided. And then we can say, wow, hey, maybe I'm a Snow White woman. Let me look at this in a different way. So an unmothered adult child can be vulnerable to living an unconscious life of serving others and open to easily being invaded because the child just wants to be good. Maybe if I'm good, somebody will see me. But what happens is we can create a helpful false self. So we adapt and survive by just being good. But we're not fully grounded in living connection to the self. So our fairy tale Snow White lives motherless for 1 year and hence misses the essential mirroring and bonding with a good object that any child needs to forge to connect into the true self. So I'm going to leave you hanging with that one. And we're going to continue. And we're going to start to understand how this dangerous innocence leads her to a glass coffin. Because that's another form of frozen life. So tune in next week. And thank you for telling people about this. And just remember, with all of us, that every person has a secret that would break your heart. So be kind and be open and think about this. Because we've all got a little Snow White within us. Okay, next week, LorraineNeithardt.com or Venus Unplugged on Blog Talk Radio or call 212-757-8914. And into the snow I go. Bye-bye.